I call the Assistant Treasurer.
Madam Deputy Speaker.
Order!
Madam Deputy Speaker,
Order.
another example.
The member for North Sydney will resume his seat. The member for North Sydney was heard in silence. The Assistant Treasurer.
Thanks, Madam Deputy Speaker. Another example of the Liberal myth-making machine in overdrive. As we've seen it in the last 24 hours, another example from the member for North Sydney. Now, according to the Leader of the Opposition, according to the member for North Sydney, according to the other spokespeople, if only the Australian people had had the good sense to keep them in office, everything would be rosy. Everything would be fine. The deficit would be lower, the debt would be lower, unemployment, I think, would be lower. According to their narrative, everything would be fine if only the Liberal Party had retained their rightful place as the born-to-rule party of this nation. But at the heart of their narrative, there are two patently false claims. Two claims so laughable that I would have thought the opposition would be embarrassed by the paucity of their argument, by the plain sophistry of their narrative. Now, the first proposition is this. The first false proposition is this, that the deficits would be lower in future years under the opposition's plan because they wouldn't have made the direct payments to families that we made. That's proposition number one, that we wouldn't have had the cash splash, they say. We wouldn't have sent $900 to working families, so our deficits would be lower. Now, let's put aside the fact that those payments have been so important in keeping the Australian economy as robust compared to the rest of the world as they have. Let's put that aside. Let's just look at the fiscal impacts of that decision. Now, we went down the road of payments to families because they were temporary and because they were targeted, because they'd washed through the budget, because almost all the impact would be in the 2008-9 financial year, and they wouldn't be a drag in future years. And what did the opposition say at the time? They said, we wouldn't do that. We'd oppose that. We wouldn't do that. We wouldn't make the $900 payments to families. Instead, they said, we'd have tax cuts. They said we'd have tax cuts, permanent tax cuts. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition called them broad and sweeping tax cuts. Now, the Leader of the Opposition made a virtue out of the fact that they would be permanent. He even trotted out academics, John Taylor from Stanford University, to say people need to know the reduction in their tax is permanent, so they increase their spending. But, of course, a permanent reduction in tax means a permanent drag on the budget bottom line. A different approach to this government, not temporary, not targeted, but a permanent drag on the bottom line. So that means whereas our stimulus payments to families have no impact on the budget in the out years, theirs would have an ongoing impact. They come in here and claim the mantle of fiscal responsibility. They say, we stand for lower deficits, we stand for lower debt, when their policy would directly mean higher deficits and higher debt. They are hypocrisy personified, Madam Deputy Speaker. They are engaging in a blatant falsehood with the Australian people, taking the Australian people for mugs, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now, the second false premise is closely related to the first. That is that the increase in the debt and deficits over the forward estimates isn't primarily due to the revenue write-down that the government has experienced. We just heard the Shadow Treasurer say that again, that the main impact on the deficit situation has been government spending. It hasn't been revenue write-downs, they say. Now, this reached its most ridiculous, I have to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, last week, on May the 7th, on the AM Agenda program on Sky News. Now, it was a debate between our colleague, the Minister for Small Business, and the Shadow Minister for Small Business, the member for Moncrieff. Now, I have to confess, Madam Deputy Speaker, I didn't see it myself. I heard about it. And I've got a bit of a soft spot for the member for Moncrieff, and I couldn't believe it. I thought the story must be embellished. So I went and checked the transcript, ready to leap to the defence of the member for Moncrieff. But unfortunately, it was indefensible. He said this, and I quote, Madam Deputy Speaker, "We put forward our proposal for the stimulus package this year, which would be about 50% of Labor's. Therefore, this year the deficit will be 50% less." Now, let's just think about this. He said, our stimulus will be 50% less, therefore our deficit will be 50% less. Now, of course, there's a small problem with this equation. As the Minister for Small Business correctly pointed out during the program, because it completely ignores tax write-downs. It completely ignores the wrecking ball that's gone through to the Australian budget as a result of the global economic downturn. The fact that tax receipts have fallen so dramatically. The revenue loss in 2008-9 is $23 billion. Didn't happen, according to the opposition. Member for Moncrieff says didn't happen because he says the only driver of the deficit is the stimulus program. If we have a 50% less stimulus, then we'd have a 50% less deficit. Now, that's just not right. Putting aside the fact that arguably they wouldn't have had a 50% smaller deficit because they believed in, as the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, who's present in the chamber, said, broad and sweeping tax cuts. Her economic narrative is that they would make the government money. Remember that? Broad and sweeping tax cuts would actually make the government money, just before she lost the shadow treasurership of Australia without seeing one budget. Without seeing one budget. Wonder why that happened when they engage in voodoo economics. Now, we can't be too harsh on the Deputy Leader of the Opposition and on the member for Moncrieff because it comes right from the top. Madam Deputy Speaker, it comes right from the Leader of the Opposition himself. We've heard it even today. The Leader of the Opposition said to Sky News this morning, in 2012-13 there'll be a net debt of $188 billion, an almost inconceivable figure. Now, since he was elected, Mr Rudd has spent $124,000 million. So, in fact, it is about two-thirds of his debt is represented by his spending since he got elected. So, yes, the economic downturn has hurt us, no question. It's affected tax revenues, but the biggest contribution to that debt has been discretionary spending by the Rudd government. Now, let's have a look at the Leader of the Opposition's maths. He says net debt in 2012-13 will be $188 billion. Yes, he's got that from the budget papers. He says the new government expenditure is responsible for $124 billion. Now, if that's right, if that's correct, that means the revenue write-down would be $64 billion. But we heard the Shadow Treasurer last night say he accepts that the revenue write-down is $210 million. So the Leader of the Opposition, by his maths, says it's $64 billion. $64 billion. And now the Leader of the Opposition says that's not the case. Now, the Leader of the Opposition needs to explain his maths. He needs to come in here and justify his sums. He needs to say how he came to that figure. Because if he can't, he is clearly engaging in sophistry of the most willful and disgraceful type.